Shalom from Jerusalem. This is TV7's Israel at War update. And as we're set to deliberate the latest developments here in Israel, throughout the region and beyond, with chief focus, of course, on the Iranian front, the eastern flank of Israel, it's always important to remember how this war began. 376 days ago, on October 7th of last year, the Islamist Hamas and its terror affiliates in the Gaza Strip launched a surprise onslaught on southern Israel, declaring war by perpetrating a massacre, murdering some 1,200 mostly civilians, wounding over 4,800 others, and kidnapping roughly 250 people, including elderly, men, women, children, and infants. 101 of them remain in Hamas captivity to date. The subsequent day, on October 8th of last year, Iran essentially joined that war when it green-lighted its proxy in Lebanon, Hezbollah, to launch cross-border attacks against Israel. Since then, Hezbollah launched over 12,000 projectiles toward Israeli territory, and not Hezbollah alone. Additional Iranian proxies from Syria, as well as Iraq, as well as Yemen, have launched direct attacks against Israel, as well as Iran proper, which for the second time on October the 1st has launched a direct attack on Israel with 181 ballistic missiles fired towards Israeli territory. Let's now turn to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by retired Brigadier General Mark Kimmett, formerly an Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs in the United States. It's always a pleasure to have you here, General Kimmett. It's a pleasure indeed. I'd like to ask you particularly on the visit earlier today by the Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi in Jordan, Amman, with his Jordanian counterpart Ayman Safadi, during the course of which they discussed, of course, the anticipated Israeli retaliatory strike against Iran, which may occur at any given moment. What can you tell us about that? He is also set, of course, to travel later in the day towards Egypt for his counterpart in Cairo.
Well, first of all, the issue of airspace came up, and the issue of Jordanian participation in the counter-drone operation, counter-missile operation against Iran came up. I mean, it's his first visit was to Iraq and now to Jordan, and I don't think that's coincidental. I think what they're trying to make sure is that Israel does not have an opportunity to use Jordanian airspace or get Jordanian assets to participate in a direct attack against Iran. I think in general, the subject of the regional dynamics is what was and will be discussed with Egypt. I think this is a charm offensive going on by the Iranians that are trying to characterize themselves as peaceful neighbors, that this is all being provoked by Israel. I think they're doing their absolute best as well to start the old anti-Semitic view of the region and trying to turn the clock back to 1948. I don't think they're going to be successful. I don't think they're going to be able to drive a wedge in the alliance between the United States, Jordan, and Egypt, and certainly not the increasing move towards rationalization and diplomatic renewal with Israel.
Indeed. Well, whatever the Iranians are trying to do, I think you characterized it quite accurately. It seems like they are, at the one hand, claiming to be a peaceful neighbor. On the other hand, every country where they embedded themselves into is turning into failed countries with roaming militias doing Iran's bidding on their behalf. And not only that, we see that the last strike on October 1st by the Iranians against Israel included also a couple of those projectiles landing in Jordanian territory, claiming the lives of Jordanian people. It occurred also in the previous attack on the night between the 13th and 14th of April. Go ahead, General.
Yeah, I just don't know what the Iranians have on offer. There's not much that they can bring to the table. They certainly can't bring money to the table. They certainly can't bring a long cultural alliance with these countries to the table. So frankly, I have no idea. It almost is a charm offensive that has been developed out of desperation rather than any kind of meaningful relationships that they're offering.
Indeed. Well, that's a big question mark. That should be referred to them, of course. But let's now turn elsewhere here in Jerusalem, where we're joined by Mr. Ori Saschal, the head of the research department at the Israel Defense and Security Forum. It's good to see you all. I'd like to double down on that question and actually ask you, to what degree is Israel closely monitoring those various meetings that the Iranians are engaged in, and what can we learn from this tour, namely, and started, of course, in Lebanon, then it continued to Syria, as General Kimmett also mentioned, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, now Jordan, and soon also Egypt. It seems like the Iranians are very stressed ahead of what Israel may unleash upon it.
Absolutely. You can smell and witness the sweat from the Iranian regime over the course of these days, because they're witnessing their regional assets being decimated one after the other, which leaves them ever more vulnerable for a potential attack. Iran has really nurtured a regional network of let's call it the Ring of Fire, led by the Quds Force, and the goal was to recalibrate the regional balance of power. So, as in Gaza, you have Hamas; Lebanon, you got Hezbollah; Yemen, you have the Houthis, etc., the militias in Syria and in Iraq. And then one by one, Israel is hitting them very hard to the point where they become irrelevant, really, on the battlefield. And so, if I were the regime in Tehran, I would monitor closely what my plans are for a possible future clash with Israel. The only hope they may have is, of course, the upcoming U.S. election. Israel's calculations are very much likely to be affected by it. But absolutely, I mean, we saw even the late foreign minister, Abdullahian, going in between the Arab capitals in the region, offering them Iranian support over the first few months of the war, defending really the Hamas cause over the podium of the United Nations, and visiting Nasrallah in his bunker. We saw the previous one, Zarif, really with his charm offensive, really sealing the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, by attempting to fool the European Union and the West with really empty promises. And so the Iran is clinging on, really its future is hanging by a thread, and it's beginning to run out of funds for all these adventures around the region. I would monitor closely the way Iran handles its oil exports, and probably a good place to start would be to moderate the Chinese influence in the Iranian market, buying literally practically 100% of Iran's oil exports. All these things really play into the calculations of the Iranian regime right now.
Well, I think it's not only China, also India is a big market that is very keen on Iranian oil for obvious cheap oil. To be able to exploit that situation is something that many countries would like to do. But in any event, when we're looking at the various countries in the region, General Kimmett, what can we hear from the various leaders, both in countries such as Jordan and Egypt, as well as Saudi Arabia, which are not necessarily friendly to Iran? Of course, publicly they'll voice their respects, but behind the scenes they are clearly adversaries. While on the other hand, you have countries like Iraq, which are between, as you mentioned also in yesterday's update, the rock and the hard place. Al-Sudani is very keen on maintaining his country's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Nevertheless, he is faced with deepening challenges, also with an increase of Iranian influence over the country.
Well, first of all, in the remainder of the region outside of Iraq, I think the silence is deafening. The fact remains that most of the countries don't want to stir up their streets by trying to take a hard position one way or the other against the cause of inside of Gaza and elsewhere. Quietly, of course, they're rooting on what's happening with the terrorist groups and with Iran. But they are also pretty much hunkered down, waiting for the anticipated Israeli attack. Don't seem to want to speak out either pro or for the attack. So I think at this point, like we've seen so many years, when there are major issues in the region that don't directly affect themselves or their regimes, they keep their heads low and for the most part, their mouths shut.
Indeed. Well, I'd like to actually follow up on the Iraqi front since in January of 2021, we heard the RGC commander or commander in chief, Hussein Salami, come out and declare that the core objective of Iran for the next 4 years during the Obama-Harris administration would be to oust the United States from Iraq. Now, the United States and the Pentagon has announced an end to Operation Inherent Resolve, if I'm not mistaken, in Iraq proper. As somebody whose expertise are second to none with regard to Iraq, what can you tell us about that, and clarify to us the various complexities in that equation, since it doesn't necessarily mean that the United States is moving out, is it?
Yeah, first of all, I wouldn't consider myself an expert on Iraq. I just spent a lot of time there. There are a couple of things that came up with this agreement. I think it's important to understand that prior to 2014, we, the U.S., had a bilateral relationship with Iraq, a bilateral military relationship that had basically replaced the multinational mandate that we had in 2009. So between 2009 and 2014, there was a U.S. military presence, mostly in the advisory and the assistance capacity. And it was only until 2014 when ISIS was barreling down on Iraq and Baghdad that the Iraqis reached out to us to reverse the decision that had been made by Obama and said, please come back and help us with ISIS. Well, it's a natural consequence that 10 years later that there would be less of a need for a U.S. combat military presence inside of Iraq to fight ISIS, which is barely a terrorist group inside of Iraq, numbering in the low hundreds. What we have stayed there for, in a very, very small contingent of about 2,500 troops, is to fight ISIS in Syria. The presence of the Americans and the mission of the Americans has been vastly overstated and been used as a political punching bag against Sudani, which is why we simply came up with the agreement that said we would transition Operation Inherent Resolve from a multilateral operation to a bilateral operation in 2026. It may mean little or nothing depending upon how the political opposition to Sudani or whoever is successful will be at that point. The fact is that, below the surface, everybody wants the Americans to stay, primarily because it's a stabilizing factor, even if it's only 2,500 as opposed to the 150,000 that we had in 20 years ago. It's more symbolic than it is functional, and I would not necessarily concern ourselves too much on the absence of the Americans because, number one, they're not really there in large numbers at present, and number two, they're really not being thrown out or leaving. We'll probably maintain about 1,000 plus in Iraq, although primarily in Erbil.
With that being said, there are implications to the partner nations, which now also need to transition into a bilateral composition, taking into account, of course, a couple of thousand troops from the Netherlands, Germany, other European nations, Britain, Canada, and Australia. But when we really look at the broad picture, it does raise a question within a number of countries in the region about Iranian influence, and there are a few very famous European generals as well as American or Canadian generals that said in the past, all you need is one American troop in order to assert American dominance in a territory. Of course, the question whether or not that is true also for the Middle East these days is another thing. But Mr. Issachar, when we're looking at Israel, one of the decisions as a reaction to the announcement by the Pentagon is to deploy one additional division on the eastern flank of Israel, namely the border with Jordan, raising the number of divisions on defensive posture there within Israel's Central Command, not to mistake it with U.S. Central Command, establishing new fortifications, barricades, and other sophisticated systems for the event that the Iranian proxies, namely Hashd al-Sha'bi in Iraq, other Iranian proxies in Syria, may exploit a diminishing presence, at least the perception of a diminishing presence in Iraq, in order to challenge Jordan proper. What should we learn from such a move?
Well, Iran has recognized that Jordan is an easy prey, and to judge by the success they managed to sway Sunni Hamas in Gaza and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, also a Sunni group, you can see how the conversion of interests work here, whereby sworn enemies like Shiite and Sunni actually could collude in favor of targeting Israel. This does not fall short of Palestinian presence in the Kingdom of Jordan, where estimates say over 80% of the population is Palestinian, and the Hashemite royal house is really hanging by a thread as it is. Israel has been attempting to moderate these attempts. The United States has really artificially compared or kept the Jordanian currency, the dinar, at the exact same rate as the US dollar. Israel is transferring not only millions of gallons of water annually, but also ammunition, like to fight ISIS. The remaining Cobra helicopters were transferred to Jordan a handful of years ago. But all of this could be artificial had Jordan not taken steps to moderate Iranian influence, nor accept phone calls, for example, from former Iranian Foreign Minister Abdullahian, who called his Jordanian counterpart, really attempting to warm up relations between the countries, mulling a visit by Jordanian officials to Tehran one time. All these things really show us that Iran is interested to widen its scope. Jordan has Israel's longest border, 500 kilometers. It is, under its auspices, really a whole host of illegal weapons flow into Judea and Samaria, arming Palestinian armed groups. All these things, on the one hand, Israel is interested in maintaining a stable Jordan. On the other hand, it really does, as you just mentioned, have to maintain control of the border. Otherwise, it could lose control over what's flowing from the Jordanian border, even risking opening a new front in the very extreme scenario of Jordan losing control over Iranian influence in its midst.
Thank you, Mr. Issachar. General Kimmett, one reactive point to this?
Yeah, I would simply say I wouldn't be too concerned about a ground invasion coming out of Iraq, primarily because although it is not heavily publicized, it is in the public domain. There's a very, very large American presence in Jordan that has been there on near the Iraqi border for years and years, primarily in support of Operation Inherent Resolve, but also to conduct other activities both in Iraq and Syria. So as long as that force is there, I don't think there's any concern about number one, a land invasion from Iraq, and number two, any suggestion that there will be an internal military coup that could take over the Hashemite leadership. The United States is there not only economically to prop up their economy, but also militarily to prop up their defense.
Indeed. I wasn't sure if it was public knowledge or not, so I'm happy you cleared that part. Let's move to the northern front. Lebanon, we're seeing continued fighting in a phone conversation between French President Emmanuel Macron and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The French leader calls upon Israel to basically establish a unilateral ceasefire, granting Hezbollah leeway, basically, to survive this without too much damages. With that, of course, we at least I remember back in 2023 when France backed the Lebanese government in trying to push the extension of the UNIFIL mandate to establish new constraints on UNIFIL that would demand of it to coordinate any move to inspect certain sites of Hezbollah or suspected sites where Hezbollah was roaming, something that was ultimately pushed back and revoked by the United States, Germany, and others. But I'd like to ask you, General Kimmett, if we start with this aspect, what are we to expect in Lebanon since the complexities there are very old? It seems like the alternative forces need Hezbollah to be even weaker in order to really establish a possible alternative to that powerful militia, which may be bleeding, but it's certainly not dead.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's for others to explain what's going to happen in Lebanon in the future. I don't have a crystal ball. The fact remains is I think the United States continues to support Israeli activities inside of Lebanon up to a point. I think the United States would prefer to see the Israeli ground forces not go beyond the Litani River. Obviously, we've heard of late some concerns coming out of the White House about humanitarian concerns, both in Gaza and inevitably they will come towards focusing on Lebanon. Although one wonders if that's political gambit between now and the election, or if that's actually serious. But I think at this point, the United States is more than happy to continue to support the defense of Israel from rockets and missiles coming from Hezbollah inside of Lebanon. Relatively passive on the issue of movement of Israeli forces north towards the Litani River. Probably would be a little concerned if it looked like this was going to be a repeat of the Second Lebanon War by crossing the Litani and going further north into Beirut.
Of course, General Kimmett is referring to the letter sent by Secretary Antony Blinken and Secretary Lloyd Austin to their counterparts in Israel, in which they basically threatened, unless there is a better flow of humanitarian aid into the northern Gaza Strip, the United States may reevaluate its military support for Israel. So close to the election, it's my guess, as good as any, that it has a political dimension to it. Go ahead, General.
Yeah, I would say that I'm surprised that hasn't been mentioned before by the administration, because that's actually a congressional requirement, not an executive branch. The executive branch has probably been holding back on adhering to that law that we commonly known as the Leahy Law, which says that any suggestion of human rights violations, any credible allegations of human rights offenses requires the country that is receiving American aid to no longer receive direct U.S. military support, except under extraordinary circumstances. I think they're getting pressure from the left wing inside of Congress as well to take off that emergency circumstances, get out of jail free card. But obviously it could be for political purposes as well.
Well, thankfully, with all of the rampant disinformation coming out of various totalitarian regimes here in the region, disinforming the American public, the Congress in the United States, as well as the Senate, as well as the executive branch, they are all privy to some more clear their own information, which is quite clear that the State of Israel is operating within the scope of the laws of war, laws of international humanitarian law, and so on and so forth. But Mr. Issachar, we do not have very much time, so I would like to hear your take on the Lebanese front as well. What can you tell us about that at this point?
Yeah, so we actually see Hezbollah on its knees, by its own admission. Naim Qassem, the senior Hezbollah official, former deputy of Nasrallah, said they agreed to a ceasefire proposed by Nabiha Berri, head of parliament, a ceasefire that they encouraged him to propose. but not from a position of weakness. Normally, if someone is not coming from a position of weakness, one doesn't have to say it. It just shows. But it only shows it illustrates what position Hezbollah has brought upon itself. What Nasrallah called the Lebanese front of support is now becoming really a disaster for Lebanon. IDF troops continue to uncover attack tunnels, including major headquarters of the Radwan forces in South Lebanon. And I do, if you look at it and zoom out very briefly, Iran has fewer and fewer arrows in its quiver now. It is concerned, and the way Israel is succeeding right now after 1 year of war really is not the projected trajectory that Iran has hoped for this multi-front war. I do believe that down the line, a common sense arrangement with the moderate Lebanese forces will be achievable with the help of international forces to actually enforce that Hezbollah never again rearms and South Lebanon remains demilitarized. These are, of course, very ambitious goals, but they become ever more possible to realize after the past month.
Very ambitious goals is an understatement. I don't think that with the current tactical and operational activities executed by the IDF, we will reach those goals, since they are too limited in scope, very close to the border. They're not even exceeding the 5 to 10 kilometer line. So I wouldn't go that far as to establish those parameters. Nevertheless, I do appreciate both of you, Mr. Issachar and General Kimmett, for all of your insights, and I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Since we've run out of time, there was still much to discuss. Plenty of things are happening throughout the region and beyond, but until our next update tomorrow from here in Jerusalem. Shalom.
My name is Doron Gavish, and my background, 30 years of serving in the Israeli Air Force. My last job, I was the commander of the Israeli Air and Missile Defense during the introduction of the Iron Dome to the defense of Israel. All of this allows me really to be part of the team here in TV7. It is super important to have such a platform. We talk about the global situation, we talk about Israel and those different angles which are relevant to the discussion.